Petra, thank you so much for such a generous introduction, and thank you, John. And it's such an honor to be a part of such a wonderful panel of incredible professors. I want to start by telling a story about a very important lesson that I learned as a graduate student. And this lesson was about the importance of connecting our intellectual work to creating public change, creating social change, and to work towards making sure that our intellectual work is part of the public conversation. So I was preparing for my oral exams as a graduate student, and I was working with a wonderful professor named George Chauncey, and it was the night before our first meeting, and I had stayed up all night, and I had immersed myself in all of these important books on 20th century American history. And when I got to the meeting the next morning, I got there early, and I'm thumbing through my notes nervously, and our meeting time came and went, and I didn't see George, and then I knocked on the door, and he came out and looked at me kind of quizzically as if, what was I doing there? And I said, George, we have a meeting today. We're going to talk about my oral exams. And he says, oh, I'm so sorry, I completely forgot. We're going to have to reschedule. And I thought to myself, now what on earth could be more important than my oral exams? This must be something amazing. And it actually was. George was writing an amicus brief for the famous case, the Lawrence versus Texas case. And if you'll remember, this was a case that said that laws banning sodomy were unconstitutional and were a violation of our rights to privacy. So George was working on something so important, and he was connecting his own intellectual work to a very important public debate and public conversation. Now, at the time, I didn't get it, but later I realized that this is what we are truly called to do as academics, that we have an obligation, almost a solemn obligation, to open our eyes to the conversations and to the debates that are happening in the public, and to connect our own research to those debates. And when we do that, it becomes so inspiring for our students. For me, it opened my eyes to so much more that I could do as an academic, that there was so much more beyond the classroom that was important for me to get involved in. So I was always so appreciative to George for missing my orals meeting and making me see the world of academia as much broader than what I had originally thought. So my goal in teaching history is always to make sure that it's very personal. I do this by trying to engage students who are majoring in everything from chemical engineering to English. I try to create assignments that allow students of all types to shine, whether that be creative writing posts on a blog, or whether that be oral presentations or group projects. I want to give every student the chance to show their talents. So one thing that I like to do to make history particularly personal is in an introductory seminar that I teach on African American women's lives. I start our class by having all of the students talk about their grandmothers. Now, when the students begin talking about their grandmothers, often the students who are not African American assume that their grandmother's story might not fit with the themes of the class. But how surprised they often are to find out that their grandmothers, who may have been raised in Shanghai or Mexico City, have just as much in common with the grandmothers who were raised in Harlem or Detroit or Chicago. And we often come back to the stories of these grandmothers over the course of the quarter so that the students can see just how close history is to them. We often think about history as being something very distant, but once we bring their grandmothers into the story, we begin to see that their grandmothers were the witnesses to many of the most important events in the 20th century. And in some cases, their grandmothers were actually the agents of change of many of the most important events in the 20th century. The other thing that I think is so important for us as teachers to do is to make sure that we see in our students something that they perhaps do not yet see in themselves. So it's very important for us to encourage the creative writer, to encourage a student who may be a computer scientist to realize that they have an incredible talent in creative writing and that they should submit an essay for publication. It's very important for us to nominate a student for a prize that they may not have considered themselves eligible for. It's very important for us to encourage a student to go to graduate school who may not have ever thought that that might be a part of their future. So in conclusion, I want to say that I think one of the most important things that we can do as teachers is to really get to know our students, to get to know them not only as students in the classroom, but to understand them as human beings outside of the classroom. What makes them passionate? What inspires them? What makes them laugh? What do they do when they're not in our classes? Because the more that we know about our students, the more we can connect with them. The more that I learn about my students, the more energized and the more passionate I feel about my teaching. And the more I want to become a better teacher and a better scholar. So I'll end by saying this, that by getting to know our students, we get to know ourselves, and we get to enrich our own teaching and our own learning. So my almost 5 words are, get to know your students because you need your students and they need you. Thank you.